Dr. Andreas Amos from Munich Re. So Andreas is the medical doctor specialized in internal medicine. He has been working as a full-time medical consultant at Munich Re in Munich since October 2003. In addition to his work in assessing individual risks in all types of international life insurance, he has been involved in developing criteria for medical risk evaluation for the Munich Re manual MIRA. Moreover, he has been presenting and publishing the results of Munich Re's medical research in Australia and Asia, Europe, and also South Africa over the last few years. Dr. Andreas, I would now pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction. I hope you can all hear me and see my slides.
Yeah, all is good.
All right, thank you. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the session about potential future impact of COVID-19. And I have learned that the motto from this conference is that actuaries want to thrive through COVID. COVID being the letters for a couple of thriving variables. And what I will do now is give a little bit of background about where we are with COVID-19, a little bit of a recap, what happened, and then also discuss the important parameters that we need to know, or that also you need to know, in order to get a better idea what the further impact of COVID-19 might be in our area. So let me start with my next slide, which I cannot forward right now. Sorry for that. Just give me a second. So I'm not sure, my slide does not forward now. It should actually. I will stop sharing and share again. Sorry for that. All right, so let's try again. So yeah, here we are. So to give a very quick recap about what happened since COVID-19 broke out in 2020, there have been a couple of, I would say, very important events that, of course, I can only summarize here quickly, very broadly. Some of you, and I'm sure a lot of you have also heard presentations last year after the outbreak happened, that we were discussing along these non-physical interventions, right? How much does mask wearing, physical distancing, and other stuff help to prevent the spread? We finally ended up, because research was going on that fast, that we had vaccines available at the end of 2020 and rollout could start in the beginning of 2021. So we had this silver lining on the horizon that we have now something available that could finally end the pandemic. And I have to admit that I also hoped that we would already be a lot further as we are at the moment, not only here in Southeast Asia and Singapore, but basically around the entire world. So after the rollout, you're all aware that something happened that was quite unexpected here. So I thought this was a very unexpected development also under researchers and experts, that variants occurred, variants of the virus that changed the game very, very much, and is a big issue and the problem why we are at the point where we are still today. I will talk about that on my next slide. Nevertheless, we have improved. We have partly significantly improved. You know, we are talking about endemic COVID in Singapore now. We are doing this partly in other countries in Europe. Not a lot of countries are still there, but endemic COVID is close. And we will have to see how this further plays out. I will also refer to that on my next slides. This is also called, as you know, from the Singapore government, the new normal, right? And it's going to be probably a new normal for some more time. As I said, we could be a lot further. The problem that actually occurred, why the pandemic is not there where we could probably be, was the variants, as I mentioned earlier. And worldwide, you've heard that the Delta variant is the predominant variant since it was first detected in India and then spread around the world and has become the predominant variant almost anywhere, with some exceptions. Now, why is this such a problem? And to explain this to you, I have to talk a little bit about the features of the Delta variant, which partly refers to things that we've discussed last year, right? So the Delta variant makes airborne transmission a lot easier. You might remember that when the breakout happened in the beginning of 2020, the concept was more that the virus spreads via small droplets, right? And this is why even mask wearing was not even thought to be necessary in the beginning. But then with the variants coming up, and this has to do with the fact that the virus replicates in your pharyngeal cavity much more significantly to much higher levels, airborne transmission became much more of an issue, airborne transmission via aerosols. This also enhanced what we call super spreading, the problem that one single person, if a lot of persons are together in a group or in a room, can very, very efficiently spread the virus to others. And this means, and has ended up in this calculation that you can see here on the left side, which means that what we call the basic reproductive rate is up to 8. The initial strain that occurred in the beginning of the pandemic was around 2 to 3. Now we are at 8, depending on the research you're looking at, partly up to 10, which means one index person, so who is infected, will on average, without any additional measures, spread the virus to 8 other people instead of 2 to 3 in the beginning. And this has really, really changed the game with Delta. The other thing with Delta was also that what we call immune escape occurred. Immune escape means that the virus has mutated in a way that if people have some form of immunity, be it they have had the virus already, or be it that they have been vaccinated, the virus somehow manages to escape this immune response and still can infect somebody. And as such can also lead to onward transmissions from somebody who has some basic level of immunity. And this has, all these factors have changed the game with Delta quite significantly. So basically, this concept of herd immunity that you have very often heard, particularly last year, which meant that if vaccination is available and we might reach a certain level of vaccinated people, so immune people in a population, we can probably end this because the chain of infections will be broken and the whole thing will die down. With these factors that I just explained, we have to say that herd immunity is essentially impossible. This is not going to happen anymore. The virus will continue to circulate in populations. It will never completely die down again. The other thing that we need to know, and that's why I've highlighted this here, which is important from our business perspective, even if we have quite high levels of immunity by vaccination. So for example, like in Singapore, like 3 weeks ago, we were at 85%, and this was also at a threshold that was announced by the Singapore government as being the important one, where we can then move to another phase. You still have 15% of people vulnerable who haven't had the virus because they are not vaccinated and they have not had it by natural infection. This means, because of all these factors, that inevitably at some point in time also these 15% will be infected. And of course, if they keep on not being vaccinated, or not having any level of immunity by natural infection, they are still at risk of developing severe disease, being hospitalized, and maybe die from it. So that's the problem. And this is also important to understand this concept of endemic COVID. So you've all heard this. Endemic COVID means the virus is circulating in a population, it's circulating across the global population, and it will stay, right? So, and if you want to move, or a country wants to move into an endemic phase, you really need quite high vaccination rates, plus maybe those from natural immunity, certainly above 85%, to really control the transmission in the pandemic to an extent that you can handle it. So very much what we see in Singapore now, right? So we from a level of 85%, we started with moving into this endemic phase. Still, we were applying, or the Singapore government applies non-pharmaceutical interventions. We're wearing masks. We have to physically distance. We cannot meet in larger groups, because slowly, yeah, you have to make sure that the immunity level in this left 15% grows and grows and grows. And then you can keep your number of people who get severely ill, have to be hospitalized, and might die from it, at a quite acceptable and low rate. The other thing with endemic COVID is, and nobody should be scared about this, because of this ongoing transmission that we will see, and because of the fact that vaccination only works from an immune response in a systemic way, we will all get over the next years the COVID infection anyway. So we will kind of update our respiratory system by having the infection. We will by then hopefully all be protected, all be vaccinated, maybe even boosted, and as such the risk of getting a severe disease is quite low. And the last aspect for endemic is this monitoring of vaccine effectiveness, because this, what you have heard about, this probably waning effects. And now let's look at some data regarding the vaccine effectiveness, how it influences certain parameters of COVID. And this is quite interesting, because there's a lot of information out in the news that tries to convey that the vaccines are not as effective, and that's why we should be quite worried. But if you look at the data, the picture is quite a bit different. So this is from the UK and Singapore. On the left side here, this big table is from UK data. The UK has excellent epidemiologic data collected and analyzed. And what you can see here is, and these are the different vaccines. This is Pfizer, this is Astra, which is not available here in Singapore. This is Moderna, which is available. That we have different parameters that are influenced by vaccination, right? It's first of all infection in general. So you get the virus, it gets entrance into your respiratory tract and actually replicates there. Then symptomatic disease, so that you have the virus and have symptoms, the ones that you all know. And then also, and this is very important for us from mortality perspective, hospitalization, severe disease, and then mortality per se, of course. And you can see that at least for some time here, 3 to 4 months, applying to this data, these vaccines are very effective in reducing mortality. And basically across the board here, so Pfizer and Moderna in particular, AstraZeneca as well, the attenuated virus vaccines that we also have in Southeast Asia, also in Singapore, like Sinovac and Sinopharm, according to the data that's available, are a bit lower here, but still they are quite effective. So mortality-wise, these vaccines do work. You can also see this from the Singapore data here. So this is from the MOH figures that are regularly published. I'm aware that you will also hear another talk on the MOH figures, but I still show you this table here. So this is differentiating unvaccinated and partially and fully vaccinated people. And you look let's just have a look at the overall rates here in terms of mortality. So people died, the percentage of people died who were infected and tested positive. In the unvaccinated, it's 1.3. In the fully vaccinated, it's 0.12. So this is around a factor of 10 reduction in mortality. And this is what we also see from other studies. I will show you another one in a minute, which confirms that the vaccines really do work. Nevertheless, we have to watch and monitor what we call waning of effectiveness. Now, this waning means that the effectiveness of vaccines reduces after some time for a couple of reasons, but we have to be very careful with that. We know that the waning in particular applies to these two parameters here. So infection and symptomatic disease. Hospitalization and mortality, there seems to be at the moment a little bit of a drop, but not as significant as it is for infection and symptomatic disease. And also from a medical background perspective, it's not expected that impact on mortality will decrease to a very, very low level after some time. At the moment, the booster shots, they are happening for two reasons. We want to booster all these protection against all the parameters here. For the younger people in particular, we are mostly reducing this one. So infection, symptomatic disease by the boosters. For the old and more vulnerable one, for those with risk factors, booster has also an impact here. So waning typically occurs in older people and those have risk factors like some immune deficiency, or just because they are at a quite older age. I told you I will show you also other efficacy data that was recently published. This is from Scotland that looked at different age groups in terms of impact on mortality from the vaccines here. You can see the different age groups here. And I found this quite interesting also from an actuarial perspective because this gives us the death rates broadly, unfortunately, only in these age groups, 18 to 64. It would have been nicer to have them in more narrow age groups, but nevertheless, you can see in this younger age group, the mortality decrease here is from around 3 per 10,000 person years to 0.8. So the factor in reduction is about 3.5 to 4. If you go in the age group 65 to 79, it's getting really significant here. So from 64 to 4, so this is a factor of around 15, 16. And then in the 80 plus, it's even more pronounced. It's a factor of around 30 or something. So these vaccines, if it comes down to mortality and death, they really work. Yes, we have to monitor waning of vaccine effectiveness. That's why we are boostering, particularly in the older age groups and those that are vulnerable, but the vaccines still do work even with the variants. So from what I have told you now about mortality, we can basically come to the conclusions if we want to look at the future impact on particular mortality. So further waves that might come up, they will, not only in Singapore, but of course also in other countries, very much depend, as I explained to you, on the level of basic immunity. So determined by vaccination in particular, of course, natural immunity as well. This plays partly a role in countries that have had quite significant waves last year and the beginning of this year. In Singapore, it's mostly vaccination for us because Singapore has had this zero COVID strategy. So almost, or essentially no one had contact to the virus. So natural immunity doesn't contribute so much here. It's mostly vaccination. Of course, vaccination rates in insured population play a big role if you're dealing with countries where natural immunity has happened and vaccination, the vaccination roll-up is not that far from a whole population perspective. It could still be the case that in the insured population, immunity is different. It might, in most cases, probably be higher. And this might impact the impact of future waves as well. Waning immunity I mentioned, this is monitored. Again, as I said, waning immunity is less of a problem in the younger and generally healthy individuals, which mostly represents our insured population. But for the older ones and with risk factors that are or should basically be underwritten in a proper way, waning is more significant. Of course, if future waves occur, these non-pharmaceutical interventions are still important, even with vaccination, as you can see in most of the countries. I'm not sure if you have seen what's happening in Europe at the moment. Depending on vaccination rate, there is a quite significant surge now in cases, partly also because all these measures like mask wearing, physical distancing and stuff has completely been given up. And for that, vaccination rates have not been high enough to really prevent a significant resurgence now. One thing that is, of course, important is this year, future variants. So future variants might occur and might give us some additional headache. Nevertheless, what I can tell you from a research perspective, future variants, even if they occur and even if they have higher transmission rates than the Delta variant, are not expected to completely wipe out particularly the immunity against severe disease and hospitalizations. So future variants are still expected that the level of immunity that we gain by vaccination and also by natural infection will contribute and protect us at least to some level. It could be that a future variant, if it's even more transmissible, might affect a wide proportion of the population again with symptomatic disease and maybe a bit more severe one. But as I said, not completely wipe out the cover that we have by immunity through vaccines, particularly if it comes to severe disease. And available new drugs. I have not covered this here in my presentation. I'm happy to address this in the question and answer part. You have probably heard that 2 companies have recently announced that they have been quite successful in finding new drugs that might be quite helpful. But I have to say, I'm not convinced that this will be a game changer. The game changer are the vaccines, and a vaccine rollout should be complete as much as possible in the respective population that we are looking at. Now, if it comes to future impact, it's not only about mortality. And I'm sure that some of you might even be more interested in the question of what about CI? So particularly in Singapore, because the mortality impact has not been that significant or not significant at all from a business perspective for us. But what about CI? And what I think the main issue is, and you've probably heard about this, what you can see on the illustration here on the top, that when COVID happened and we didn't have vaccines available and hospitals had to prepare for a potential significant surge in cases, a lot of cancers screening was abandoned, or what we could see is that cancer rates all of a sudden dropped. I'm sure also in your companies, you might have seen a dip in critical illness CI claims. And what I try to address here is, first of all, the reason for it, and then the potential impact over the next couple of years here. This is again data from UK, and it talks mainly about breast cancer. Breast cancer is one of the cancers that has a quite high incidence, so it's an important cancer for us, and it's one of the cancers with colon cancer and cervical cancer where we do a lot of screening. So screening in order to detect cancer at an early stage, to treat it, and as such reduce the impact, as you all know. And what you can see here is that by mid of last year, there was this significant dip in breast cancer diagnosis, particularly for the early stages here. So stage 1 and stage 2 in the UK, and then levels continued to go up again. This was after the first wave and was mainly due to the fact, which you can see at the lower illustration here, that screening was just almost stopped right during this surge in summer or in spring last year. So this was the main reason why breast cancer cases, or the incidence of breast cancer, went down. Now, the question is, with restarting screening, so again looking for cancer, what might the next years be looking like? What will this mean for our critical illness cancer incidents and claims that we might see? And this is a quite interesting publication here that addresses this question depending on restart strategies, what might happen. And what you can see here is just a point where the restart of screening strategies was introduced again. The different colors represent different screening strategies. I will not go into detail here. You can imagine that you can restart screening in different ways. You could, for example, say, I skip totally those that I've missed and just continue over with those that were anyway planned for or after this break happened. You can try to catch up with screening and so on and so on. And what you can see here is the incidence or the change in incidence. So this is the basic level here, and this of course would indicate an increase. And if we go down here, this would be a decrease. Now, what you can see here, and I think that's the most important thing for us, that depending on screening strategy, there is either an uptick followed by lower incidences here, or you go down with the incidences first and then you catch up at a later stage here. And then around 2 years to 3 years later, the whole thing kind of wanes off here and settles down, and no more impact is seen. So depending, as I said, on the screening, the restart of screening strategy that we have. So what we basically can say is, depending on how screening will be introduced again, incidences might first rise or then decline, but then there will be a catch-up again of the cases. If you look at the area under the curves very roughly, this is not a calculation now, you can see that probably the incidence is not gonna be higher after the increase from what we saw in the decrease before. So overall, if you look at multiple years, there shouldn't be a significant uptick in cancer incidences, which is good to know. And then finally, the whole thing will anyway calm down here in this simulation. It was in end of 2024. So from that perspective, I think what we can conclude here is that for cancer, that we don't have to expect a significant increase in incidence. We might see a catch up after screening has restarted. The offset might not be to a more significant extent to what you might have seen in drop of incidences during a decrease during COVID times. And I also want to add here on this slide the cardiovascular impact, which talks about MI. So the question, is there also an issue for cardiovascular, which is a very important CI component of our products as well. And what you can see here is, and this is data from the US, that in 2020, we had this significant decrease here also in April in acute myocardial infarction. So at much lower levels than we had them in 2019, right? Now there are two different kind of myocardial infarctions in general. You don't have to understand this. One is referred to as STEMI and the other one is referred to as NSTEMI. And NSTEMI, just as a very general and broad explanation, means these are the milder ones, the ones that are sometimes not even coming along with a lot of symptoms. And what you can see here is that the drop happened in these NSTEMI ones, whereas the STEMI ones, the more significant ones, as I call them here now, remained almost at the same level. And now, if you then look into data in terms of the risk of another event after you have had such an NSTEMI, it talks about 10% risk over the next 3 years, so roughly about 3% or 3.5% per year, which fortunately is not as high as somebody might be afraid of. So also for this, we can conclude that this drop that we have partly seen in reduced myocardial infarction diagnosis will not end up in a significant research over the next 2 or 3 years. So, this brings me to my conclusion slide here for CI. So this temporary decrease that we have seen in cancer diagnosis very much had to do with reduced screening. And as I showed you with this study, that the resurgence of the cancer diagnosis that we might also see in our claims will depend on the mode of screening restart. The good thing is that the expected resurgence does not seem to exceed the reduced incidence during COVID-19. So there might be some offset, but very likely not to a more significant extent, which is quite good news, I think. And if we look at cardiovascular, a complete offset of this decreased myocardial infarction incidence during COVID-19 is very unlikely over the next 2 to 3 years. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I have a little bit run over time, I think, but hope there's still time for 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Andreas. Let's just quickly go through the Q&A board. We have 2 questions here. So the first one, that's a little bit technical. So thank you, Dr. Andreas. So COVID statistics abound online, but no one expects that it's still not clear today is what the excess mortality or excess morbidity are. Many of the death and the morbidities have been associated with co-mortality and as well as comorbidity. Therefore, it is not clear what the efficacy of the vaccines are. What are your thoughts on this?
This depends on the data and the country you're looking at. So I know that this applies if you have a quite low burden of death in Singapore, then this is for sure true. But if we look at excess mortalities in other countries with significant waves, there is definitely an excess mortality, and you can also measure that. And regarding the vaccines, you of course can measure this quite well if you are designing the monitoring in a good way in a population, and you look over time how much of those who are infected either die or do not die. The data is very, very robust. So vaccine efficacy definitely can be assessed in a good way, and what I showed you are reliable or is reliable data.
Okay, that's good news. Second one, we have you know that certain cancers can potentially be induced by viral infections like HPV or hepatitis. Would there be possibilities of COVID resulting in an increase in incidence like lung or kidney scarring, which will lead to higher cancer incidence?
So I have to say we cannot conclude on this because we just do not have the data. So for now there is nothing in the short term, but it's not really expected because the virus itself is a respiratory virus. It's an RNA virus with a quite short genome basically, and those cells that are affected are typically dying and will be replaced by healthy tissue in the future. And cancers that and viruses that induce cancer typically survive in the cells, get into the genome of healthy cells, and then they change the genome in a way that cancer can start to grow at some point in time. But this is very unlikely for COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2.
Wow, there's an overwhelming question suddenly. Okay, let's just quickly run through it. So COVID exhibit multi-system impact, including cardiovascular, increase in incidence of myocarditis observed on vaccination among young males. Would that potentially impact myocardial infarction rate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we have partly seen is that there is an increase even after you recover from COVID in some subgroups of people. So also after you have recovered for a couple of weeks, there is an increased myocardial infarction rate. But this has very likely to do with the fact that these people already have some form of myocardial problem, of myocardial vessel problem. So they might have already some stenosis or some arteriosclerosis in their heart vessels. And depending on the severity and such a COVID infection, if you survive a severe course, this has a multi-system impact, which is true, which can partly affect or accelerate the point in time until somebody who already is vulnerable gets a myocardial infarction. But for healthy people who recover, the risk of increasing myocardial infarctions is probably not really significant. We have to say that COVID can affect, and we know this, a lot of organs. We know this partly from the brain, as was mentioned. We know it from the heart, which is not that unexpected, because this receptor that COVID binds to is also present in other organs. But we have to say that this is probably also the case for other viral infections. We are a bit maybe biased now because COVID is so much and so thoroughly under investigation, and we are not doing this anymore for a lot of other infectious diseases. So for example, if you have a very severe influenza, so flu course, which can happen every year, we have endemic influenza, as you know. If you would analyze all these people, they would probably also have some affection of organs, as we can see it now for COVID. But yes, it's true. We have this multi-organ affection, and we partly have not understood all the long-term impact, of course. I actually had one slide left on long COVID, but I skipped this due to time constraints. We will have to see what this long COVID really means. The understanding is not as good as I hoped it would be at that point in time, until we can come to a final conclusion here.
Yeah, I think everyone is very interested to understand the long-term impact of COVID issue. So maybe probably just let me group all the questions currently on the Q&A board. So I think two of them is asking, if there's still insufficient study on the long-term impact of COVID. So what's your view on the impact of long-term COVID issue on CI incidents or mortality incidents?
Okay, so I bring up the last slide that I basically skipped and explain it by this. So the long COVID is a syndrome that, first of all, comprises a lot of different symptoms that we're looking at here. You've probably heard about this. So this can range from clearly sequelae from organ impact. Because you've had a significant pneumonia from ongoing chest pain or coughing, and ranges to neuropsychological symptoms like fatigue here or memory loss, right? Till really mental issues like anxiety, depressive symptoms, and so on. So it's a variety of symptoms that are presented. The problem with this is that the studies, and we have now some good available, and the first ones that we were looking at, they were not really well controlled, which means we had no idea if some of these symptoms could also be induced by other factors. So for example, by the fact that we're going through lockdowns, like particularly in Singapore, right? And had to stay home for a long time, didn't have contact to other people, which, as you can imagine, can at least partly also induce these symptoms on the mental health side, and maybe also these here, right? So these neuropsychological ones. I think we all could feel the burden from these non-physical intervention measures over the last 2 years now. So this was a little bit the problem, and the latest studies, and these are now control, they seem to indicate that some of these neuropsychological and mental health symptoms are not due to COVID, but they are more due to the circumstances of it. The good thing is that also vaccines seem to have a quite positive impact on a long COVID syndrome. But the problem is now, and now I'm referring first to DI to answer the question, that regardless of if it's really the disease itself, so COVID, that induces the symptoms, or it is the fact that it has to do with lockdowns and stuff, doesn't really matter to us, because if it affects our long-term DI impact, it's still a problem for us. So, but that refers to DI. For CI, I have to say we would have to expect, as we discussed earlier, significant impact, for example, on cancer or cardiovascular. And on the long term, I do not really expect this, except for those who really had a severe organ impact. So the primary organ being the lung, for example. So you could have, after very significant COVID pneumonia, long-term lung impact that leads to respiratory insufficiency, which is a CI trigger. There could be a kidney impact, which leads to kidney failure in the long term. So yes, this could happen. But the very severe cases are fortunately quite low in incidence. So it should not be too much of a problem for us. So for CI, I do not really expect this. And for mortality, I think I mentioned this already. In the very long term, I don't think that long COVID will all of a sudden increase mortality again. This is all about the mortality that is induced in the acute phase when you have no level of immunity and get a severe course and getting hospitalized. This is the decisive part of the infection where most of the mortality occurs.
Okay, good. Then thanks for the very detailed explanation. I think we just go to one last question. We already addressed the kidney problem, I believe, in the just now the slides. So just one last one on the cancer part. So with delayed screening due to COVID, what do you think about the deterioration of cancer staging due to delayed diagnosis? Would it be more significant for a certain cancer site? And do you have any suggestion on how should we estimate the impact of this?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's really difficult to say, and because the thing is that we do not exactly know. And I showed you that particularly the early cancers were missed due to screening, how these cancers progressed. We have some idea about cancer progression, but you have probably also heard that with all the screening that we are doing, and we know this particular, for example, from the thyroid cancer experience, that there is a lot of overdiagnosis happening with screening, which means we are detecting cancers at an earlier stage, which probably would have never become a problem because they would have never grown to a higher stage, then have become symptomatic and then become a claim for us, right? We know that this also happens for breast cancer. The magnitude of this is not quite clear yet. And depending on this, the question is, will we really see a big uptick over the next years for those where screening was totally missed? If it was totally missed, and then they are detected at a later time. My expectation would be, to be quite honest, because I think screening programs will restart, and from what I know, some of the screening will be caught up. So those who have missed screening will not completely abandoned over the next month and years. So they will again start screening. That cancers, of course, will be found, and those who don't, or will not be screened anymore, some of them will not progress to higher stages of cancer and will such not become a claim. So I don't expect that this will really significantly increase advanced cancer claims for us. But I also have to say that there are a lot of uncertainties in this assumption. And of course, we will monitor this and try to get a better idea when we have more data on that.
All right, cool. All right, that's interesting. Thank you everyone for the overwhelming questionnaire. Also for Dr. Andreas.
Thanks.